Okay, so I said in the last lecture that Sartre thinks we are, in a sense, condemned to be free. Freedom is inescapable. And I want to go a little more deeply into what that means in this lecture, and also want to talk about his claim that we try to avoid this through self deception. You know, radical freedom of the sort Sartre thinks we have is terrifying in a sense. It's daunting. It is hard. So Sartre thinks we want to avoid this by deceiving ourselves about the fact that we have such freedom. Theories like determinism, big philosophical theories, he would say, are one way we do this. But there are a lot of other little ways, right? And Sartre talks about bad faith. He doesn't mention this in this lecture, but if you read his sort of big philosophical book, Being and Nothingness, bad faith is a pretty central concept there. Like I said, I don't recommend you go out and read Being and Nothingness. There's some interesting parts in it. The stuff on bad faith is very interesting, and I think, like a lot of Sartre, I'll talk about this later in the lectures, maybe a little overstated, but also insightful, right? But the book is also just written in this really impenetrable philosophical jargon. So it's not a fun read. Unless you have a different idea of fun than I do. And if your philosophy professor is saying this bit of philosophy is not a fun read, it's probably not your idea of fun, right? But anyway, Sartre talks in Being and Nothingness a lot about bad faith. And we are in bad faith when we deceive ourselves, when we try to deny the fact that we are free. How do we do this? Well, a lot of times we just appeal to facts about ourselves. Maybe even facts about human nature. And I think it's good to look at some examples of how this works, how we do this. There was a pretty legendary governor of Alabama, Big Jim Folsom. Now, in a lot of ways, I actually find Folsom a very admirable figure. He was openly for integration, for civil rights, as a governor of Alabama in the 40s and 50s, which takes a lot of courage, right? You know, it actually ended his political career. George Wallace, who had been kind of his protege, kind of his ally, sensed an opportunity, on race and basically stuck the knife in on Folsom and ran on this horrible campaign of racism and beat Folsom for governor. I think it was in 59, right? But Folsom was for integration, which I think is just incredibly brave in a deep South state in the 40s and 50s. But a not so admirable aspect of Folsom's character was that he was, very prone to sex scandals. And Folsom actually had, I think, to my mind, one of the funniest excuses or the funniest ways of handling a sex scandal of pretty much anybody who's been in one, right? So I forget when this happened, but it was one of Big Jim Folsom's many sex scandals. He gave this speech, and he's like, I can't do a good Deep South accent, but it's funnier if you think of it in the Deep South accent. He's like, now, I'll tell you, people, there's people in this state that want to get Big Jim Folsom. And they're going to put some pretty young thing in front of him, thinking that he's going to give in to temptation and they're going to have him. And now, friends, let me tell you something. They're going to get Big Jim every time. Right? And this is funny, right? I mean, actually, it's not only funny, it has something on the mealy-mouthed excuses a lot of other politicians will use. Basically, This is who I am. They're going to get me every time, right? Sartre would say this is a great example of bad faith, right? Who knows if Jim Folsom really believed this? It's a good way to handle this. But right, he has a choice, right? When they put, in his words, some pretty young thing in front of him, if his opponents are even the ones doing this, he can choose what he does, right? It's not just, oh, my very nature, I can't help myself, right? No, he can help himself. He makes a choice here, right? You know, in a, he makes a choice. Or you'll sometimes hear businessmen say this, or sometimes maybe an econ professor will tell you this. They'll say, well, human beings evolved to be selfish, so there's no point in not being ruthless in business, right? Some other people will say this. Businessmen who are just nasty, who are selfish, who are ruthless will say, well, it's just human nature. We are selfish animals. You know, that's why I do this. And again, no, right? Sartre would say, you make a choice to be ruthless. You might hear this about human nature. That doesn't make you ruthless with no choice, right? You might hear some grand evolutionary theory about how human beings evolved to be selfish, and you might just say, well, that theory's bunk, right? Or I don't have enough evidence yet, right? And these theories usually aren't slam dunks as far as I can tell. They're really a lot of guesswork usually. Or you might accept the theory and say, well, okay, I see that by nature we are selfish, but I don't want to be selfish. I'm going to, because there are facts about human nature that I think make us selfish, I'm going to try that much harder to be a decent person, to not be selfish, to not trample over or use others. The theory itself doesn't dictate that you are a ruthless, immoral jerk, right? That's one reaction to hearing this theory, but you might not even believe it. And if you do believe it, there are other reactions you could have, right? These evolutionary accounts, Sartre didn't live, I don't know that he lived to see them become trendy. They certainly weren't as trendy now, when he gave the speech as they were then. But I think he'd just say, they might not be true. They're never, I've never seen one presented with the certainty of 2 + 2 = 4. And even if so, believing them is a choice. But even if they're true, you have a choice about what you do with this information, right? I had a long time friend. I've been friends with this guy for a while. And, in just one context, he confessed to me that over the years he had cheated many times on his wife. I knew his wife too. She was also a pretty good friend. I'm flabbergasted, right? And obviously I'm disapproving, and he says to me, well, men did not evolve to be monogamous. He never gave me the evidence for this. But even if he's right, even if, we evolved to be a certain way, you can choose what you do with that information, right? You might just say, well, we didn't evolve to be monogamous, so I'm going to have to try that much harder to be faithful to my wife, to these relationships, right? Saying, well, whatever, I'm going to go on and cheat. That's not dictated by these facts about human evolution, even if they might be true. I'll give you guys one more example. My father. Not anything like cheating. He's always, a lot of respects, been a very good husband, right, to my mom. But my dad is absolutely the worst person in the world at keeping a secret. Before Facebook existed If you wanted somebody to know something, if you wanted, in fact, the entire community to know something, tell my dad and tell him to promise to keep it a secret. So, one of the more interesting examples of this recently, my mom tells him something that she tells him, look, I know you can't tell this, right? You absolutely have to promise me you will not tell a soul. This is important. Don't tell anybody. Can you do that? My dad's like, well, yeah, I can do that. Yeah. Yeah, I'll this. So my mom tells him. Within a week, it's getting back to her. This secret. It's also getting back to the relevant people whose secret it is. She is furious at my dad. And she's like, you promised. My dad's response is, well, I don't know why you told me. You know I can't keep a secret. That's just who I am. Right? That's bad faith, right? There's nothing about my dad's nature that just compels him to go tell everybody in our hometown whatever secret he learns, right? He can make a choice. It might be hard for him. He might not want to do it. He could keep it a secret, right? Even if he accidentally blurted it out, he certainly doesn't need to go tell everyone in town, right? Which is what he does. To excuse breaking this promise to my mom, not keeping this important secret on grounds of, oh, I can't keep a secret. That's just who I am, right? That's bad faith. That denies his freedom. Folsom's excuse for his sex scandal is bad faith. The businessman who excuses doing terrible things in business by saying human nature is just that we're selfish is in bad faith. He has made a choice to do that. So Sartre, like the other thinkers he draws on, if you guys ever read Heidegger, which actually is incredibly hard, but he's a great philosopher. I'll have more to say about him in a bit. Authenticity, which Sartre mentions here, is also a central moral category for Heidegger. But what is authenticity? I promise this will tie back to bad faith and self-deception. These are very closely related things. Authenticity for Sartre is the opposite of bad faith. But when you hear authenticity, I think you have to be careful not to attribute a common view of what authenticity is to Sartre. There's a common view in our culture, and this pops up a lot in self-help books, things like that, that authenticity is being true to your deepest self. There is some deep, true you. You have to discover who that is, and authenticity is being true to that person. I am authentic when I discover who the real Sam Duncan is, what he really wants, and I am true to that and I go for it. Sartre would absolutely hate this. It would infuriate him. I don't know how Sartre reacted when he was really angry, but he would get really, really angry at this account of authenticity. He would say it is no such thing. Why is that? Well, Sartre would say this account of authenticity, there is some deep you, and authenticity is being true to that deep, true, essential you, figuring out what you really want. Well, all of that assumes that you have some given nature. that there's some deep fact or essence about you that you need to be true to. But this is exactly what Sartre denies. This is saying, this account of authenticity is saying you have an essence, a deep, true you that precedes your existence, that precedes your choices. In fact, Sartre would say that the common view of authenticity is actually a form of bad faith. It's not authenticity at all. Why is it bad faith? Well, if I justify an action in saying, well, this is the true me, this is me being true to my essential nature, doesn't that look a lot like the earlier examples of bad faith, right? You know, when my dad said, oh, I can't keep a secret, his excuse was, well, that's just who I am, right? Sartre would say appealing to some deep essential you is just the same sort of, well, that's just who I am. That's me being me, right? That is not authenticity at all. And I think there's something to this, right? If we think of someone who, imagine someone who's just terrible to their spouse and children because this person is just work driven. Every time they have to choose between the kids or their spouse and work, they choose work. And imagine they were trying to excuse themselves and they say, well, that's the real me. That's true to who I am. Work is what's important. I'm sorry you knew this when you married me, right? Come on, could you blame me for being true to who I am? Sartre would say, and I think rightly so, this person is in bad faith, right? They are making the choice to choose work over their personal relationships with their children or spouse. They are making that choice and trying to pretend that it's not a choice by saying this is who they are, right? And they're trying to make it into even something, deep and whatever by saying, well, this is just me being true to my deep self, right? My essential nature. I think a lot of times this view of authenticity pops up, the view that Sartre says is bad faith, pops up when people do stupid stuff in a midlife crisis, right? Somebody, spends an incredible amount of money on a motorcycle, and they say, well, that's, I have been this boring, play it safe person all these years, but who I really am is a daredevil. So to be true to the real me, I had to buy a motorcycle, right? They, abandon their wife or husband and kids. No, I tried to pretend to be a family person, but the real me isn't, right? The real me, I don't know. Fill in your whatever midlife crisis narrative here, right? Sartre would say, well, that's very comforting. You don't want to take responsibility for leaving your spouse and children, or you don't want to take responsibility for spending a bunch of money on a motorcycle. Isn't it just great fun that you can appeal to a true, authentic you that dictates this, right? So, all this talk about a deep or essential you and, finding the real you, finding your deep self and being true to it, Sartre would hate it, and I think rightly in a lot of cases would just call BS on it, right? We do use this as an excuse for selfish, shabby behavior in a lot of cases. If you're too young to have seen this, wait till you hit middle age and people start doing stupid, selfish stuff when they have their midlife crises. It will happen, and when they do, they might even use the word authenticity. If they don't, they will appeal to like some deep fact about themselves and being true to their real you, living their truth, blah, 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 right? If you haven't heard this yet when people do stupid, selfish stuff, you will when you and your friends start to hit 40. Anyway, point being, this is not Sartrean authenticity. Sartre would say this is bad faith. What is Sartrean authenticity? Sartrean authenticity is recognizing your freedom. Recognizing your freedom and taking responsibility for your choices and their results. Now, look, authenticity doesn't mean that you're nice, right? If somebody could be authentic and abandon their spouse and children, they could just say, well, you know what? I decided one day that this other stuff mattered more to me than y'all did. Bye. Sorry. I decided that this is what's important to me. This is what I'm going to do. That would be authentic. Be a horrible person, but you'll be authentic because you are at least admitting that it's your choice and you're not trying to deceive yourself about your own responsibility. If my dad had come home and said, yeah, I promise not to tell, but you know what? I decided that whatever enjoyment or whatever I get out of telling people secrets that I'm not supposed to, I value that more than I do the promise, or the irritation, the sense of betrayal from these people whose secret it is. I value gossip more than that, so I gossiped. That would be authenticity. It would still be a shabby thing to do. It would at least be authentic, right? I did it. I chose to do it. I take responsibility. That is what authenticity is for Sartre. You can be an authentic bastard. You can do terrible things and be authentic for Sartre, but at least you avoid this self-deception. At least you take responsibility for it. That is Sartrean authenticity. All right. Our next question, though, is, and we'll talk about this in the next lecture, this is an inspiring, if terrifying, vision, right? It's simultaneously optimistic and heroic, as well as very hard in every sense of that term. Hard as in difficult, hard as in it passes some very hard judgments on ourselves and others, right? Hard as in difficult, also hard as in very hard in character, right? Hard-nosed. If you'll excuse my, sorry, this, I guess it would be a bad pun to call this French in the contemporary lecture, might just say hard-assed, right? Well, what proof does he offer for this, though, right? It's inspiring, it resonates, especially to an audience in the France of his day, and I'm guessing with some of us too. But what would Sartre give as an argument for this very radical position? And what would Sartre say to someone who is impressed or troubled by arguments for determinism? Or if not determinism, just something like the phenomenon of moral luck, right? Nagel is not a determinist. He's very clear on that. But he's greatly troubled by the extent to which it's very clear that many of the things that we want to hold people responsible for seem to be outside of their control. Sartre plays up human freedom, the extent to which things are in our control. How is he going to handle this phenomenon of moral luck that seems to just show over and over again that there are a lot of really important things that aren't in our control? Even if we believe in free will, they're outside of our control. All right, so we'll start to get into these questions next lecture. I do think there's some very important insights in Sartre. I'm also going to be very critical of this. I do worry that we should not accept his account of authenticity completely. But we'll get more into that in the next lecture.